The advent of the torpedo boat in the latter half of the 19th century had been met with particular enthusiasm in France, where it formed the core of the Jeune École fleet. But of course, torpedo boats were growing in size, and soon the French Navy found itself with, broadly speaking, two types. A 50 to 60 ton series of essentially coastal and harbour defence craft, and a few larger classes of 150 to 200 ton ships, which they dubbed torpilleurs de haute mer, or high seas torpedo boats. This term would trade back and forth with torpilleurs d'escadre over time. Initially, it simply meant the largest torpedo-armed attack craft in the fleet, but that was about to change. Now that they had sea-going torpedo boats of their own, the Marine Nationale's officers rapidly realised that others would build counters or copies of these ships, and thus their own cruisers and battleships might meet torpedo craft out in the deep waters as well. In 1894, the British had launched HMS Havoc and HMS Decoy under the guidance of Admiral Fisher, who at the time was the third Sea Lord. These larger vessels were specifically torpedo boat destroyers, later shortened to just destroyers. The French had their own similar term for them, contre-torpilleurs, literally ships that were against or contrary to torpedo boats, but effectively it had the same meaning. This development spurred on French developments of a similar type, although it was not the only driving force. Almost a decade earlier, in the late 1880s, a mixture of torpedo gunboats and torpedo boats converted to carry more guns at the expense of torpedo armament had already been devised in the Marine Nationale. This was now codified into a proposed set of specifications for a 220-ton seagoing torpedo boat and a 300-ton torpedo gunboat. But it was noticed that there was also a proposal for a torpedo boat leader, much like the flotilla leaders that the Royal Navy would develop, which was also planned to be 300 tons and dubbed Chef de Groupe de Torpilleurs de Défense Mobile. While they were trying to sort out these overlapping specifications, the designer Augustin Normand showed up in summer 1895 with a plan for a 285-ton ship he dubbed a Grand Torpilleur, that was basically a torpedo boat large enough to do double duty hunting its own kin. He was asked to revise his proposal in light of the specifications that were already being sketched out, and he came back a few months later with a slightly larger ship that was designed to use a common hull that could be completed with either 3 single 15-inch torpedo tubes and a pair of 47mm guns as a torpedo boat, or with a 65mm gun, 7 47mm guns, and a single torpedo tube as a torpedo boat destroyer. These armaments could also, in theory, be swapped out in service as needed. The French Naval Council liked the general design, but preferred to have a single uniform armament fit, and with a few quick changes, Normand offered a ship with a single 65mm gun forward, 6 47mm guns positioned 3 per side, and 2 single torpedo tubes mounted on the centerline. In 1896, the first ship to this design, named Durandal after the legendary sword of Roland, Knight of Charlemagne, was laid down, followed quickly by another, Halbard, or Halberd, as Normand had offered the Navy a 70,000 franc discount if they ordered 2 ships instead of 1. The next year, another pair were ordered, with a slightly modified hull structure and a marginally higher bow. Falconeur and Espingole, named for the falconet, a small cannon, and the blunderbuss, respectively. The first 2 ships would enter service in 1899 and the latter 2 in 1900. They were capable of around 26 knots, thanks to 4,800 indicated horsepower generated by vertical triple expansion engines and supplied to a pair of screws, with total displacement coming in at just over 300 tons. Broadly, the ships were based on the smaller seagoing torpedo boat the Filibustière, just slightly enlarged and reinforced. Additionally, the rudder and screws were placed unusually deep in the water to prevent racing and loss of control when the ship pitched at speed in heavy seas. The machinery was likewise the same as that used in the earlier craft, with a 15% upscaling applied, and it was later found that the power plant was actually capable of considerably more output than it had initially been rated for. Durandal spent her life in the English Channel, or La Manche as the French call it, although by 1914 she had been demoted to the role of leading a submarine squadron as newer ships were much faster. She spent the bulk of World War I patrolling off Normandy before being put in reserve in 1919 and then sold for scrap in 1921. Albard was dispatched to Toulon on the Mediterranean coast and was likewise moved to submarine squadron service in 1912. She patrolled the Mediterranean during World War I and was put in reserve in 1920 and sold for scrap the following year. Falconeau went to Brest to guard the Atlantic coast, and by 1914 she was also a submarine flotilla leader, serving on patrols in the western end of the Channel in the first part of World War I and then in the Mediterranean from 1915 onwards. She would also be decommissioned and sold for scrap in 1921. Espingole had a relatively short lifespan. She was sent to the Mediterranean, but she was only in service for a few years before she struck a rock off Cape Lardier and sank in February 1903.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.